Speaker, it's my pleasure to speak regarding Bill 19 today, an act to amend the Residential Tenancies Act 2006 in respect to rent increase guidelines. And I want to first start by just recapping for people what this bill does. And of course, when we talk about what it does, we'll also see what it doesn't do. And I think when, at the end of the day, looking at what it does and what it doesn't do, you have to wonder why this bill was put forward in the form that it is. And briefly, this bill restricts and sets both a ceiling and a guideline for rent increases in Ontario. The floor is 1%. The ceiling is 2.5%, regardless of any other circumstances or context that landlords may experience. So 1% will be a minimum increase and no greater than 2.5%. And where it falls between 1 and 2.5% will be based on the Consumer Price Index. Of course, a lot of people in this House realize that hydro electricity costs are not included in the Consumer Price Index. And we've seen, even by the government's own accounts, hydroelectricity costs will rise by 47% by 2015. That additional cost and burden will be placed on landlords, and they will have no ability to recoup those losses. And of course, we've also seen what was really the motivator behind this bill was the Liberal government's insistence on putting in an HST bill a few years ago, which harmonized sales taxes and put additional costs on for everybody, including landlords. But I want to say, if the government was truly serious about solving or correcting a number of the injustices in the Residential Tenancies Act, this would have been an opportune time for them to actually make some substantive changes and well-needed changes. And I'll just give you a couple examples, and I'm sure every member in this chamber has heard directly from their constituents who are landlords, about the atrocious environment it is in this province to be a landlord. We have the tribunal for landlords and tenants. Many people know that if a landlord takes a tenant to the tribunal hearing, the landlord pays his submission fees and pays for his own lawyer. Tenants, however, have their submission fees covered, and tenants also have their legal fees and a lawyer provided free of charge, well, I shouldn't say free of charge, at the taxpayer's expense. It's a double standard here on the Residential Tenancies Act, one that is obvious, one that causes hardship, and one that should have been addressed within this Bill 19. Just to further on with the expenses, other utility costs such as water and sewer charges, which are increasing at a rate of typically around 8%, those additional increases aren't included and can't be recouped by landlords under this Bill 19. And I think it's also important just to put on the record some of the horror stories that happens with that landlord and tenant tribunal. I've experienced a number of them myself with constituents who have come to me looking for assistance. Let me just share a couple stories. I had one constituent come to see me. He had shown a house to a prospective tenant, but then turned the tenant down for a number of reasons and would not rent the unit, the house, to that prospective tenant. A couple days later, the owner of that home came back to that house and found that the person he had rejected as a tenant had moved in and was indeed squatting in his home. She had phoned up Hydro, had the Hydro put into her name, and he could not get her out. It took her 3 months to evict that person who had squatted in his home. And needless to say, there was also significant damage done to it by the time he did get her out. He did so at great cost to himself, but there was no protection under the Residential Tenancies Act for people who actually squat in other people's properties. It was just an outrageous example of the abuses that can and do happen under this flawed legislation that we now have, the Residential Tenancies Act, and which are not being addressed in Bill 19. That person actually was also, when he tried to go and reclaim his house from the squatter, he was charged with public mischief by the OPP for trying to reclaim his home. I have another example. That one was in Frontenac County. I have another one from Smith Falls. A similar situation where the landlord had shown a prospective tenant a rental unit. The landlord rejected the application, and a couple weeks later he came back and found that the applicant, the rejected applicant, had moved in and was squatting in his apartment. She had changed the locks, broken the window to access, changed the locks, put the Hydro in her name, and lived there for 3 months without cost, went to the tribunal hearings, had her fees paid for by the public, and the landlord had to bear all his own costs. In addition, that rejected tenant caused over $3,000 worth of damage to the rental unit during that eviction process with the tribunal board. You know, we have stories and stories of this sort of abuse that happens. And what have we got for a bill in front of the House now, Bill 19, which sets a minimum rent increase and a maximum increase of 2.5%, has no regard for additional costs that the government is putting on everyone, especially Hydro costs, and fails miserably to address any of the other faults and failings of the Residential Tenancies Act. Truly, if this government was being honest to itself and honest to the people of Ontario, Bill 19 should be withdrawn and come back with a proper bill that does address the deficiencies and the failures of the existing Residential Tenancies Act. I have another one here where, again, this was in the Smith Falls area. Landlord went in to inspect his property. A large family was living there. An entire room was full from floor to ceiling with garbage. It was impossible to navigate in that dwelling. Much like what you might see on these reality TV shows, hoarding, or I think it's called, or in this case, it took the landlord 4 months through the tribunal system at, again, a significant cost to himself, at no cost to the tenant, and the tenant actually received 3 one-month deferrals before there was finally that family was evicted, and then a significant cost to clean up that atrocious mess that was left behind. I really would like to see the minister redraw this piece of legislation. We can't support it like this. It doesn't take into account any of the additional costs that landlords are faced, and nor does it even attempt to address the deficiencies in the existing Residential Tenancies Act. But be concerned about the rental increase, but also be concerned about the fairness or the injustice that a piece of legislation creates as well. And I would say this, Speaker, if the member from Scarborough-Agincourt or from Davenport are so demonstrable in helping their constituents keep within this low threshold of 1 or 2.5% rent increases, go out and buy a few apartments. I'm sure you can afford it on MPP wages. Go out and buy a couple apartments, rent them out, keep under that, maybe even do something altruistic and go below the 1% rent increase. Let's put your money where your mouth is and show people just how much you care for your constituents, and buy a couple of apartments, and then experience the Residential Tenancies Act on your own. Experience the tribunal, and experience when things do go wrong. And they don't often go wrong, but when they do, they go atrociously wrong. And this government still refuses to recognize that injustice. Thank you. The member from Elgin, Middlesex, London, put it clear. There are big problems facing this country, this province.
Who said that?
The member from Elgin, Middlesex, London. It is falling on deaf ears on the government side. We have plants closing up. We have Timpkin, he mentioned, just recently closed up. And I will say, you know, as we heard from some of the other members, that there's challenges. The biggest challenge facing industry in this province right now is this Liberal government, their failed energy plan, and the member from Elgin, Middlesex, London puts it clearly in front of you. It's not time for the vote if there's still valid debate going on, as the Minister of Energy himself recognized the value in the debate. So we'll continue this debate, and maybe we'll drive some sense into some of the members on the other side.